Hi, this is Dave Hurwitz at ClassicsToday.com, here with one of the talks I've really been looking forward to, Mahler Symphony Number 6, his Tragic Symphony. This is going to be maybe a bit of a long one, so settle in and get ready for the ride, because before we even start talking about recordings and whatnot, there are two musicological issues we need to deal with. The first is the number of hammer blows in the finale, and the second is the order of the inner movements, both of which, I have to say, the critical edition has potentially, anyway, mucked up. The latest critical edition, anyway. All right, so here we are. Hammer blows in the finale. Originally, as you may know, Mahler intended that there should be 5, not 3, 5. Then it got reduced to 3, then it got reduced to 2. The fact of the matter is, musically speaking, there's only room for 2. Programmatically speaking, Mahler may have thought at some point he wanted 3 for reasons which have been amply described in the biography, that he was depicting the gradual destruction of the hero and the hammer blows get steadily weaker. But of course they don't get steadily weaker. The second one is louder than the first one, and the last one, if it's weak, might as well not even be there because it serves absolutely no musical purpose. The first two do something. They push the music off. It goes careening onto a side path into a maelstrom of tormented fury. The last one, it just sits there. It's there when, the introduction returns. So he was right to get rid of the last one. But if you want to keep it, as some people do, then the musically appropriate thing to do would be to keep it with the original orchestration that surrounded it so that it has the right context, which no one has ever done. No one ever does it, so it's pointless. Completely pointless. Now, having addressed that issue, we need to talk about the order of the inner movements. The latest critical edition has decided unilaterally that the Andante should go second, which flies in the face of just about what every recommendable decent recording does or conductors have done, because the previous critical edition had it the other way around with the scherzo second. Now, there is no evidence as to what Mahler's final intentions were one way or the other. Definitive evidence, that is, coming from Mahler himself. We know what he did. We know what he allegedly thought because Alma tells us that the scherzo should come second, posthumously. And we know that Mahler published the score with the scherzo second originally, but performed it with the scherzo third a few times, and the very few number of times that the symphony was actually played in his lifetime. So none of that is evidence that it should be one way or the other. That being the case, what the critical edition should have done, had it been intellectually honest and operating with some standard of scholarly rectitude, would be to say, we don't know, do what you think is right. That's the only answer there can be. There can't be any other recommendation. It's up to each interpreter to make a decision. Now, my strong preference is for the scherzo second, and I'll tell you why. And then we'll look at the other side too. I believe the scherzo should be second because, first of all, it uses the same motives as the first movement and transforms them. And so it's good to hear them in closer proximity rather than after the Andante, which makes it more difficult for the listener to grasp what Mahler is doing with the musical material. That's number one. Number two, I feel that the Andante is in a much more satisfactory place third, coming between two quicker movements, a slow thing, and then that big, huge, long finale, all of which are in minor keys. So it really, I think, makes sense to have your moment of repose between the scherzo and the finale. I find that when the scherzo precedes the finale, in third place, you have too much of the same thing running continuously. That's another issue. The third issue is that, interestingly, when you put the scherzo second, you have, in terms of the large-scale formal organization of the symphony, one of its principal motives, heard, which you get to hear twice, the process of hearing this motive twice. In other words, the major chord that turns minor. And so we see one of the most important topoi of the symphony being enacted in terms of the large-scale organization of its movements, which I think maybe subconsciously, I mean, how important that is, I'm not sure, but I do believe that subconsciously it matters. Now, what are the arguments for doing it the other way? Well, to be honest with you, I don't see very many. I can think of one principal one, and that's this. This is Mahler's most classical symphony in terms of structure. Mahler conceived the idea of writing a symphony that expresses the classical notion of tragedy, that is, purging the audience's, feelings of pity and terror, and arriving at an acceptance of fate. That's what Mahler's doing. That's what the symphony's about, and trying to see that in terms of classical form. Now, in a normal classical form, a standard classical form, the andante would come second. And so the classical feel of the symphony is more successfully realized when the andante comes second. And I can see how Mahler, particularly in those later performances, when he knew the symphony was a tough nut to crack and audiences might have trouble accepting it, might feel more positively towards it if the andante came second. It's a more familiar form in terms of the audience's expectation of that time. So that's maybe a reason for doing it that way. But I think though that particular explanation is outweighed by the musical advantages of having the scherzo come second and the andante third. And then once those two musicological issues are out of the way, I do want to make one other point, which is, as I said, what is the symphony about? It's about the victory of fate. You see, the complication with the hammer blow business in Mahler's mind was that he was focused, as many composers and people of artistic types are, on himself, on the hero who is killed. But that's not what the finale does. That's what we have to keep in mind, because if the hero dies after the third hammer blow, then what's the rest of the symphony for? What's the coda? What does it do? If the movement is about the hero, there can't be music once the hero's gone. I mean, Beethoven actually ran into that problem with the Eroica Symphony because he's got a huge funeral march in memory of the hero and then two more movements, which is conceptually an issue that interpreters of that symphony have to resolve in terms of how they shape and structure their performance. But in the Mahler, it's a little bit more graphic than that, because there's obviously this titanic struggle and there's obviously cataclysm going on. And one of the things about Mahler himself, just the way he thought about things, generally speaking, is that unless he was using a text to express the notion of afterlife, as he does, for example, in the Second Symphony and in the Third Symphony, and in the Fourth Symphony, there can't be anything after death. Death is the end, as it is in the Ninth Symphony, for example, which ends at the end. There's nothing afterwards. It's death. We know it. And so the Sixth would be, I think, sort of musically and philosophically inconsistent if it ended with anything other than the classical notion that the symphony is about the triumph of fate. The fact that the hero may die in the process is sort of academic, but the musical argument isn't about that. It's not about the biographical aspect, which we know is so important to Mahler and was so deeply ingrained in what he was doing as an interpreter that he couldn't really get it out of his head. And I don't think he did get it out of his head until later on in the process when he took out the third hammer blow, having realized what the music itself wanted to do, what it was telling him. Anyway, if you're curious about this, I've written an article about the new critical edition and some of these issues, which I'll attach a link to the posting here that you can look at your leisure. But now let's talk about performances. There are a tremendous number of good performances of the symphony. The irony is that it's really, really fun to play. I mean, it's just great when you're done. I mean, it's the symphony I've played the most, aside from the first of all the Mahler symphonies. And when you're done with it, you just feel terrific. I mean, it's just fills you full of energy and life, and that's that's what a tragedy is supposed to do. You're supposed to feel cleansed and purged, and the music really does that. It does it to the audience, and it does it to the performers. It's so much fun to do, and it's so much fun to do as a percussionist, I've got to tell you, because first of all, I get to use my proprietary cowbells, cowbells here, which I talked about in connection with the Seventh Symphony. And I also have a root, and I have my sledgehammer and a tree stump, which I had to take back home to Connecticut because we needed to split some wood. But, when you show up with this artillery, and especially in community orchestras that I play in, because I'm not very good, but we just, have fun. But you can actually get everyone together to do Mahler 6, which itself is incredible, that everyone shows up when you announce you're doing Mahler 6, because it's so much fun to play. And, you get everybody together and you stand behind the string section who's used to playing things like, Handel Concerti Grossi, and you start clanking and banging and, and they turn around and they're going like, what the hell is that noise? It's so much fun. So, I know that the music is very serious and I want to be serious about it, but it really is. It's just there's nothing quite like it in the repertoire. And it's not one of the harder ones to play because the forces are so large that Mahler tends to treat the entire symphony as one giant tutti. The sections tend to play together. So you don't have lots of, very, very difficult exposed solo passages. You tend to have very, very difficult sectional passages, horns in unison going, in the finale and stuff like that. It's hard, but there's safety in numbers, and it's just wonderful. So, okay, let's talk about recordings. Now, everybody's going to have the ones that they love, and I'm not going to pretend to go through the entire range of recordings that are out there. I'm just going to tell you the ones that I think best represent what the symphony is about. And some of them have 2 hammer blows, and some of them have 3. So it's okay. It really is. So first of all, here's 2 sleepers. This one, Joel Levy with the Atlanta Symphony on Telarc. He leaves out the exposition repeat, which used to drive me crazy, but now I really couldn't care less about. But it's really, really well played, really, really well recorded, and really good if you're in a hurry because you don't have the exposition repeat. And this is a very, very exciting and powerful performance in wonderful sound, and it's definitely worth considering. Next, Thomas Sanderling with the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. We don't have, aside from the Kirill Kondrashin recordings and the horrifying, awful, terrible Svetlanov recordings, a lot of Mahler from Russian orchestras. So it's really, really good to hear this absolutely first-rate, superb performance from Thomas Sanderling, if you could find it. The recordings now that maybe are a little bit easier to find and that I really prefer. I have to talk about Schulte because his was one of the sort of reference versions back in the 80s and whatnot. It's a very, very exciting performance, very well played and very powerful. I like it. I really do. I'm not usually a big Schulte fan, but his Mahler 6 is powerful and it delivers the goods. So I do want to say that I don't have that recording with me. It's in storage. It's on my iPhone, but it's a good one. Michael Gielan in his Mahler cycle. You may still be able to get it separately. Gielan was a great Mahlerian, and listen, nihilism was his thing. You know what I mean? He was great at music that was an expressionistic horror, misery music, and that kind of stuff. And he definitely gets into the symphony. There's a touch of heaviness here and there, maybe in the finale, but it's definitely a great performance. One of the really outstanding unsung performances is Riccardo Chailly with the Concertgebouw. This is a magnificent performance. I particularly like the fact that the recording is so clean and clear. You really hear the balances, the woodwinds particularly. The Concertgebouw has such a fabulous woodwind section, and everybody is in tip-top form in this performance. The tempos are a bit on the majestic side in the first movement, but let me tell you, it is immaculately played and really gripping as an interpretation. It has weight and rhythm and that sort of dark, implacable, forward momentum that You want to hear with the tread of fate inexorably approaching to stomp you down into the dust. Then we have my two favorite recordings, and you may not be surprised. They are Leonard Bernstein's first one with the New York Philharmonic, quicker than his remake, very, very exciting, very well recorded for its day, and as a total conception, Bernstein just knew the music. You can't, he doesn't actually, Bernstein's Mahler, let me put it to you this way, is often misunderstood. He doesn't exaggerate. If you have a score, and I assume some of you do, and you look and you see what Bernstein does, he is so literally faithful to the intent of the score most of the time. He does use 3 hammer blows. But when you see something that sounds like it's being exaggerated or crazy, you can almost always point to the exact moment when he does it and say, yes, this is what Mahler intended. He was a very, very faithful Mahler interpreter, almost a literalist, truly. And so I recommend that very highly. But for sheer guts and glory, Bernstein's second one with the Vienna Philharmonic, a little slower, a little weightier, dark as death in the finale. Oh my God, it's wonderful. I saw him do these with the Vienna Phil in Carnegie Hall. I remember I was sitting in one of the boxes in one of the performances. I saw all of his performances of this. And there was an extremely, extremely pregnant woman sitting next to me with her husband. And she was so mesmerized by the music, when they picked up the sledgehammer, and they have this sort of large wooden butcher block thing in Vienna. It's not actually terribly effective. The best hammer, by the way, the Philadelphia Orchestra has the best one. It's like a giant wood block in a rubber cradle, and when you hit it, it just reverberates. It's terrific. But this was good enough, and it looked terrific. It was enormous, and the guy picks it up over his head, and as he's raising it, this woman just got out of her chair and said to her husband, "Look over there, he's got a hammer, he's got it." And of course it came down and she went boom onto the chair. I thought she was going to give birth right there. Honestly, it was tremendous. But I'm going to play you just a second of this, half a minute of this performance, because listen to the expressionistic nightmare that Bernstein makes out of the introduction to the finale. Hot stuff, right? And you say, oh, there's Bernstein exaggerating. Look at the score. Look at the score, folks, where Mahler says, Zeitlassen, take your time. And he writes the portamenti and the brass parts, and he wants you to hear them. They're supposed to scare the living daylights out of you, and Bernstein does. So that's my recommendation for the Mahler Sixth. The Bernstein Vienna Philharmonic, if you're having only one. But this is the kind of symphony where no one is having only one. You need to have like 5 or 6 probably. So there are some other suggestions there too. And I know there are many other versions out there, and some of you may have favorites that you're very loyal to, and you are more than welcome to enjoy that loyalty, because this is one of those symphonies that you just can't get enough of. Thank you, and keep listening.